University of Leuven and working with there, and we're delighted that he's able to join us for the whole conference and all the setup as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you very much for the initiators and organizers of this wonderful conference next week. Thank you very much, Rebecca and Lizzie, for the smooth organizing of the last 3 days and all the hard work that enabled that. And last but not least, thank you so much, Dylan, for this wonderful heavy lifting of all the basic information and the methodological discussion, paving the way to my final discussion about the functions of Targum in medieval Europe. Now, we've heard quite a lot about Targum, and it's very much more than the recommended portion, which you mentioned yesterday. And before delving into my specific test case, I would like to focus on some points of Targum which will be relevant for my discussion. So first of all, the word Targum itself is Aramaic, basically interpretation and more concretely translation from one language to another. We use it in this context to refer to a collection of compositions, Jewish Aramaic translations of the Bible, or, well, sort of translations. And for my discussion, it is important to know that first, these translations accompany but do not replace the Hebrew text, both conceptually and materially, as Willem has shown us and as we will see later. And second, that they interpret, paraphrase, and expand the Hebrew text rather than simply translate it literally. Last but not least, Targums is a collective title for different composition. Just to give a very quick and extremely simplified overview, there are Aramaic translation in Qumran, not exactly Targums, the so-called standard Targums for Pentateuch and the Prophets probably emerged from the 1st century CE. Another group of Targums is the Pentateuch in the Palestinian Aramaic dialect, probably emerged around the middle of the first millennium. This can be debated. Targums to the writings, and a third Targum to the Pentateuch, probably much later, for the end of the first millennia, even the early, perhaps the early Middle Ages. And lastly, as David pointed out, thank you very much again, actual manuscripts of Targum are much later. The great majority of them, especially of the complete ones, are mainly from the 13th century onwards. And in my presentation, I will focus on the, again, standard Targums to the prophets and Pentateuch, and in the way they are represented in medieval manuscripts. Now, just as Targum refers to different compositions, it also has different functions, as again, we represented in so much detail and accuracy. I would like to draw attention to the, tension or relationship between the exegetical and ritualistic function of Targum. On the one hand, it interprets the text, but also has uses in liturgy and in other contexts of practice or of performance, and to the different functions of Targum in the early or Talmudic times versus medieval times. And I will focus on these ritual functions between the early and the later period. So what are the ritual functions of Targum? Again, we then presented them thoroughly and wrote quite a lot of examples and references from the Talmudic times. I will present here only one source, which Willem did not mention. Thank you very much again, Willem, for this. This is from the Babylonian Talmud Megillah, where we read that in the Torah, in reading the Torah, one man reads or chants, and only one translates. In the prophets, one man reads, and up to two may translate. In the Hallel and the Megillah, reading portions from the writings, even 10 men may read and 10 may translate. Now, this is actually a Palestinian source quoted in the Babylonian Talmud, probably from around the 1st century CE, give or take. And what does it talk about? It describes the public ritual of reading Torah or other portions of Holy Scripture along with translating them. And it describes that this translation should be done by one or two or even 10 men. So even though we're talking about translation, moving from one language to another, the important thing here is not only the translation as such, but the reading of the Targum. We quite likely do not speak here about spontaneous translation, but about performance or chanting of an established text. And more importantly, even though the content of this translation is probably important, its performative aspect, that it's being read by more than one person in a large group, is even more important. Perhaps even to that, on the expense of its comprehensibility. Think of 10 men or 10 people reading the same text together. It's not necessarily extremely understandable, but it's very impressive. And here I mention again Stefan's demonstration of the Samaritan reading that we heard, which is of the Song of the Sea. It is so slow, it's almost ununderstandable, but it's very solid. One last point, which I didn't put on the slide. The source does not say that one should translate. It simply takes translation or the reading of Targum for granted. When translating, translation should be done. In public, translation should be done in this way. Now, what happened when we moved to medieval period? So I'll give again only very few sources or quotes. In response by Rav Natronai ben Hillel Gaon from Babylonia at the 9th century, Rav Natronai complains about those who do not read the Targum, saying, we do not need to translate with the Targum, but rather in our own tongue, a tongue the public understands. Well, these people, said Natronai, they do not fulfill the religious duty. So, Aramaic is no longer spoken, at least by some. Targum is no longer read, again, at least by some. And, at least from Natronai's point of view, Targum becomes, or is, a religious duty. It's not only something that is done, it's something that should be done. And similar situation and similar opinions appear again in the book of Rabbi Yehuda ben Barzilai, or the Book of Times, Sefer 18 from Barcelona in the turn of the 11th, 12th century. And in general, Rabbi Yehuda ben Barzilai has very strong opinions about various issues, including about Targum. He also contains a lot of information about Targum in this period. At any rate, again, Rabbi Yehuda complains that we see that currently in most places, the people are all together sinning by not reading the Targum in public at all. To the extent that most people forgot the commandment of Targum. We don't hear about the commandment of Targum in the Talmud, but from Rabbi Yehuda, this is already an established religious mitzvah. This is not only opinion among medieval authors. Slightly later, and slightly to the eastwards, we read in the Tosafot, the collected commentary on the Babylonian Talmud, in this case from France, from about the 12th, 13th century, that on this Talmudic statement, we rely for not reading the Targum of the haftarah throughout the entire year, as well as the Targum of the Torah. So, Targum is not read, and that's completely fine. We have a Talmudic statement to support this. And from the support, but also from the comments of Rabbi Yehuda and Rav Natronai that we saw, it appears that not only the Targum is not read, Targum is irrelevant. People don't know Aramaic. If people need to translate, they will translate to their own tongue. Talmud is meaningless. Well, is it? Let's have a look on another. Let's have a look on another source. This time from Mahzor Vitri, whom David introduced in his lecture this morning. Both a prayer book and a collection of liturgical laws from France, beginning of 12th century, give or take. And at a certain point, Mahzor Vitri instructs that on the 7th day of Passover, a minor read the Targum verse by verse. That's also on Shavuot, but not on other festivals. So, indeed, Targum is not read, except on special festivals. Yesterday, Jeroen introduced some, interesting features, interesting textual events in the Targum for the Pentateuch, read on festivals, and in the rest of my presentation, I would like to focus on the reading of Targum in Europe in the haftarah of the festivals, and a certain interesting features of this Targum. So we start by reading from another medical author, in this case Rabbi Yitzchak ben Abamali, in his legal code called Haitur, written in Marseille in 1179. And Rabbi Yitzchak begins by referring to Mishnah Megillah, where we read that the one reading the Torah should not, the one reading the Torah should not read for the translator more than one verse at a time, but in the prophets, 3 at a time. Now, Rabbi Yitzchak focuses on the last portion of the Mishnah. He has several comments concerning it, and then he adds that the practice of our predecessors was to read the first 3 verses and translate them, and from there on, they would read 1 verse at a time and translate it. But now it's customary to read the entire haftarah 1 verse at a time and translate 1 at a time. Both these practices, they break from the Mishnah, and particularly the first one, the practice of our predecessors, is a complete innovation, again, compared to the Mishnah. This is what Rabbi Yitzchak ben Abamali reports about the practices. What does the manuscript say? Well, here's a manuscript from today in Berlin, presenting the haftarah for the first day of Passover from Joshua chapter 5. And it's a fine representative of the costume of alternating 1 verse of Hebrew and 1 verse of Aramaic, verse by verse. So far, so good. But this is not the only practice, or not the only layout existing. This is another manuscript from here in Oxford, manuscript Oppenheim 14, which we actually saw 2 days ago in the manuscript exhibition. Again, haftarah for first day of Passover. Again, Hebrew verse alternating with Targum, but the first block of Hebrew and Targum contains 3 verses each, while the rest of the haftarah contains 1 verse at a time, alternating. This is a 3-1 alternation, the practice of our predecessors, which Rabbi Yitzchak ben Abamali described. We saw 2 manuscripts, but what is a manuscript evidence? So when I made a systematic examination of biblical manuscripts, European biblical manuscripts that contain haftarot according to their regional identification, and also according to the script. So it, to some extent, represent where they were written, I hope. And out of the total of this number of manuscripts, there is a very large group of manuscripts that represent the 3-1 alternation, particularly in the Ashkenazi and French script. As we saw, this is a practice of our predecessors, according to Rabbi Yitzchak ben Abamali. And a smaller but still significant group represent the 1-1 alternation, and the present customary is at the end of the 12th century. We're still missing some manuscripts to reach to the total number. These contain the Targum in different fashions that do not reflect the alternation. By the way, if you look on the first row, you will see that 15 plus 3 plus 15 sums up to 33, not 32. That's because one manuscript presents 2 practices. What we don't see here is the practice of the Mishnah, that prophets 3 at a time. And indeed, this practice is not represented. This practice is not represented in the European manuscripts, and I examined. So far concerning the biblical manuscripts, what are they actually? So these manuscripts contain the Pentateuch and the Haftarot, usually for the entire year, plus sometimes other material. But as for Targum, we contain the Targum only for the Haftarot of the festivals, particularly for Passover and Shavuot. So these manuscripts represent, let's say, a liturgical set. They contain the reading of the scriptures that were actually read in synagogue. And they were, by all likelihood made for as practical objects, for practical use. Thus, I assume that at least some of them, if not most of them, reflect the actual practice. So far concerning biblical manuscripts. I've also examined the evidence in liturgical manuscripts, in prayer books, though I must say this is a work in progress. The examination of liturgical manuscripts is much more time-consuming, and simply didn't have time to go over all the material. But from those that I've examined thus far, I can say that first, the 3-1 alternation is very common in Ashkenazi French manuscripts. I found it in 8 out of 13 such manuscripts that I examined thus far, and it is not attested at all in other traditions. At least I haven't found it yet. Dramatic pause. So, to sum up the evidence, we've seen the commonality of the 3-1 alternation, again, particularly in the Ashkenazi French manuscripts and authors, and we see that this practice has no basis in rabbinic sources or in any other sources, for that matter. So where does it come from? One explanation suggested, well, this innovation reflects the lack of competence in Aramaic. People can no longer hold reading 3 verses of Targum throughout the whole of Torah because Aramaic doesn't mean anything, so that, let's say, a reading Aramaic. That's possible, but, well, it is really the case. Let's have a look again in Zohitri, in another passage, where it describes the reading of the Targum of the haftarah in the festivals, and it says that on festival, when it is customary to read the Targum of the haftarah, the one reading the haftarah reads 3 verses. Then the translator says Rashiyot. These are introductory poems that present the haftarah, or in this case the Targum of the haftarah. And then he translates 3 verses, those 3 verses which are read. From there on, the reader reads 1 verse, and the translator translates 1. So this is the 3-1 alternation that we've seen previously, with an important addition, the reading of Rashiyot before the beginning of the reading of the Targum. Now, these Rashiyot are medieval compositions. Some of them are signed by known authors. They are in Aramaic, because they introduce the Targum, and they expand the ritual of reading Targum. So Aramaic is perhaps no longer understood, but it's certainly not dead yet. So I found this explanation of lack of competence not completely convincing, and I would like to suggest, perhaps not in place, but not instead of it, but in addition to it, that we also have here some kind of a special opening, having an unusual beginning of Targum, perhaps in order to have a festive Targum, which agrees with the festive occasion. This is, after all, a liturgy for the festivals. That's a text which should have been completely obsolete, and it's no longer understood, and it's no longer a translation, actually gains new vitality for its performance and innovative performance in the Middle Ages. So, to conclude and to draw some more general thoughts about the reading and the place of Targum in medieval Europe, on the one hand, the reading of the public reading of Targum declines, probably ceased. On the other hand, alternative forms of reading emerged. We saw the innovation in the reading of Targum on festivals. Another, alternative reading, which I would not have time to discuss here, is a private reading of Targum. I spoke about it in the Groningen Oxford Joint Conference about months ago. I would just briefly say that whereas in Talmudic times, the Targum is public and private reading is a very marginal costume, in medieval Europe and later the private reading becomes a general and a common costume, whereas public reading, as we saw, probably ceased. And I think that both of these phenomena show in different ways how the relevance of an obsolete text and the vitality of an obsolete ritual to some extent, because Targum was no longer relevant, it gained new life. Thank you very much for your listening, and looking forward for your comments.
Thank you very much, Shirley. Yeah, fascinating. Just a quick question. You knocked on the head the idea that it was due to incompetence. So how do you think Targumic Aramaic was sort of kept going? Because it wasn't used very much, so the chances to learn it presumably were small, and the other sorts of Aramaic that people would be exposed to in a study context would be things like Babylonian Talmud, which is a completely different sort of Aramaic. So how do you think people managed to keep up even with just enough for the festivals, or was it just completely worth learning?
I think that I need to unpack this question because you refer to several, or at least I see it as referring to several different aspects of, let's say, the use of Aramaic competence or the Aramaic literacy in the Middle Ages. I can start with the question: how did people learn Hebrew in the Middle Ages? And let's say that default language for rabbinic writing in the Middle Ages is Hebrew, or some kind of Hebrew, but Hebrew is not spoken. Not in France and not in Spain. But still, it seems to us, or completely normal, that Rashi or Yitzhak ben Avraham wrote their commentaries or their conclusion in Hebrew. So perhaps part of the question is, Aramaic was not completely, Aramaic simply was not spoken. That doesn't mean that it wasn't used, and was that people were completely incompetent of using it as a literary language, let's say the secondary literary language. And I feel that it does have a much larger place at the, or use than people usually actually. I tend to think them too. But recently, the Rashidot, for instance, these are Aramaic creations. Some of them certainly medical. We have Rashidot from Benutan, Rashi's grandson. Another example, perhaps the most famous example is the Zohar. But again, I don't want to get into this discussion. You're asking about how would they know to write in Targum Aramaic? Well, they didn't. One of the, let's say, salient features of medical Aramaic is that it's horrible. It's simply horrible. And when talking about the Piyutim, some of them are completely illegible. And it's very difficult to know if it's illegible because the author does the best to write in the most embellished and difficult way they can, because that's how people write Targum, or because our text is simply corrupt, or maybe because that's how they thought Aramaic should be, but they use it for we simply don't understand because they try to interpret them according to correct Aramaic. So people actually learned Aramaic from any source that they had, from the Babylonian Talmud, Palestinian Talmud, Midrashim, Targums, and other sources. In another presentation, I thought I was able to trace some Syriac elements in medical Aramaic compositions. That's open for discussion, but only to say that perhaps even these kind of sources were a sample of that.
Thank you. Harold.
Thank you very much for your paper, and also to Willem. This is really not a question, however I try to phrase it. It's just a comment. I was missing in reference to Yehuda ibn Quraysh and his beautiful Risala about the ignorance, especially in North Africa, and he speaks about the Targum haters and everything. I mean, does this explain a little bit also maybe to Sarah's question? He speaks also about the interaction of Hebrew and Arabic to the extent that the Hebrew pronounced there isn't proper Hebrew, it's more Arabic than Hebrew, and the ignorant people there think it's Hebrew, but actually it's Arabic. So, yeah.
Just to clarify, is the question why you didn't include a reference to Yehuda ibn Quraysh? Because
probably this is the best way to phrase it as a question, yes.
Because I didn't have time. It was in an earlier version of the presentation. I decided that I have too many sources, and but it's a wonderful source. It actually gives third view on Targum, where it says it's not it doesn't say it's a religious duty. He certainly doesn't say it's alright to abandon it completely by the other side. He's enraged of the people who were there to abandon the practice of the forefathers and of the Targum, because Targum enabled them to understand the Hebrew. So for him, reading Targum in synagogue is, let's say, of an exegetical value. And this is the opening of his Risala, and the rest of the composition is dedicated to lexical discussion about Hebrew and Aramaic, which have very little to do with Targum as such. I mean, Targum functions because he uses the Aramaic words to interpret the Hebrew and to show the connection between Hebrew and Aramaic. Again, extremely interesting text in itself, if you're interested in this of words. But it's so anyway, thank you for this question that allowed me to reintroduce Ibn Quraysh into the discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So I heard this paper together with the paper that I heard last March, in Groningen. And I really love the project and love the way you're talking about sustaining a tradition that might not be about literacy, but about preservation. And so I wanted to ask you, and I love the presentation, and I found it very compelling, this idea of vitality of the obsolete. So I want to ask a question about the obsolete and the ways in which your argument can be generalized to a lot of other things. So to ask you to reflect a little bit on temple practice, so related reading and study of, for example, about sacrifices. Images and rituals that are no longer relevant or understood, and you already mentioned, Q-team. So I want to ask you this big question, kind of saying it's completely compelled what you said, that it's about preserving something that's obsolete, but the word vitality is such an interesting word with respect to that. Can you talk more about Targum as a practice, a ritual practice that isn't about literacy, but is about, I don't know, you have to end the sentence. I'm not sure how to complete it, but I'm asking you not only to talk about Targum reading or Targum as actually I'm thinking about this whole discourse on Pierre Adot. It's kind of like Targum as a spiritual exercise. I'm not sure if you would agree with that, but certainly preserving the obsolete has to be more than reading, which is why we call it playfully non-reading. Okay.
First of all, thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the discussion about vitality, from where I took the term and the concept. As for generalizing, it will be extremely important to do it in one day. First of all, it probably won't. Preservation is perhaps to some that's too static a word, because but preserving Targum is copying it, and perhaps also studying. But here's, as you said, much more is done. Targum is alive. Perhaps it's not understood at all, or we don't know to what extent it was understood, but certainly understood by some. Did the people in the synagogue who heard it understood it? I'm not sure. Perhaps it didn't matter. The important thing is just to hear the recitation. Again, I'm completely fantasizing now, but you can perhaps think of it as a kind of form of devotion, which is somewhere, let's say, in the middle between a ritual or the performance, which is only about form and action and has nothing to do about the meaning of the word, and on the other hand, and between the actual study. And again, in this case, I think reading of the Targum is not a good example, because at least I focused only on its form, how it is performed, said nothing about its content. But the issue of private reading is really something that is in the middle. On one hand, this is an action which is an action of study. We read the Targum in order to know it better, to be prepared for synagogue, just to understand the Hebrew text, etc. On the other hand, certainly in medieval and actually up to this time, this practice becomes again a religious duty. And I just saw a commercial for pamphlet for a new edition of a Targum with Nikud in a, let's say, a traditional or ultra-traditional context, which starts by citing more contemporary rabbis that say that anyone who reads the Targum which is in the wrong vocalization does not fulfill his religious duty, which sounds exactly like what Ronai says, but he is speaking about reading Targum privately. Because reading Targum in the synagogue, of course, it is unthinkable. No one reads Targum in the synagogue, well, in the Yemenite community. So this is, I think, it could show this perhaps kind of movement that Targum is a text with content and important. It's important to read Targum in its localization because a wrong localization would give a wrong meaning of the words. But the important thing is not to know what this word means, is to read it twice, once every Sabbath. How does this relate to studying Mishnah Kodashim when there is no temple, or to what is it, Lavas or Lavas, saying that at the end of Yom Kippur, that please make my blood and fat that I lost today be considered as the sacrifice that we used to sacrifice in the temple. Again, that would demand much larger generalization and abstraction, which I don't think we're able to do in this context.
I think you answered the bigger question anyway. Thank you.
Oh, hi. Thanks very much for your paper. It was really illuminating. I just have two small questions because I hope you am interested in what you make of it. Because you cited the Habitur, and that's interesting. It's slightly differently worded from the Tosafot on Gilad, where, because the Tosafot includes the phrase so that they should not err. So they are allowed to read 3 verses at the beginning, and then they may move to 1 verse, but they explicitly add the phrase so that they should not err. So there, it seems to be a matter of competence, at least according to the Tosafot, because the Tosafot can be a bit problematic, but I would be interested to know how that works. And I would be interested to know what you make of the argument that Jan Frankel had about the, what I call mystical quality. And that, to me, recalls what I believe, in memory said, that's Seth Swartz said about the Piyutim, that they are so complicated that they actually serve, and much of the service also serves to sort of create a space with a sort of atmosphere, sacred atmosphere, numinous quality, just because you don't quite understand it, and therefore it has a tremendous quality.
So you're dragging me exactly to the point which I said I don't want to get into, but I won't refer from it. To answer the first question, I think that the easiest question would be, I do not want to cancel or to reject the claim of incompetence, even though I crossed it out, I know. I think what I want to say is this is not the only explanation. So certainly there were also factors of, how to say, I'm mixing the English word. Let's say shrinking of the practice, because again, it's no longer meaningful. People no longer can stand these long readings. Perhaps they don't remember the few verses if they read it from memory. So all this is certainly can happen. Something that could be also, let's say, adding or parallel motivations for actually having the Targum read in this, particularly in this way. If you like to say, to preserve the 3 verses and not just turn it completely to one alternation. As for the mythic or numinous language, I'm not easy with these terms. I might feel better with calling it esoteric or perhaps simply special. Aramaic is certainly the, let's say, I call it the secondary literary language, or the less used literary language. So I'm not at all certain that it is, was perceived as particularly connected to mystical or magical contexts, in which it is certainly used, no question about it, but it's used also in other contexts. I mean, some of these Aramaic Piyutim are completely, what would you say, prosaic. There are also simply tales, folk tales in Aramaic, which, according to the horrible language, I'm quite certain that they were written by someone who didn't speak Aramaic and who knew Aramaic only, let's say, from self-learning from their own grammar books, because there were no grammar books. It also had its place as simply one more accessible or possible Hebrew Hebrew language, Jewish language. Why the authors of the Zohar chose it, I'm sure it has to do also with the short. Let's say esoteric or less common aspect probably contributed to it, I give it. But I'm not sure that this or a general characterization is completely justified. Just one more thing, I think that the role for Aramaic as a literary language in the Middle Ages needs to be reconsidered. Not only use the Zohar and the mystic and magical sources, there are many other sources that should be brought into consideration. But there are.
David, if you could make it very quick, because we have to segue into our...
Can I just say a word in favour of ugly poetry? just as it's something that's interested me for a few years. I know that in Sanskrit and Indian poetry from about the 9th century on, there's a tendency towards making this really complicated poetry that doesn't kind of work properly. And it spreads through Iran. You get the kind of obviously Hariri Maqamat, and then it gets into the Syriac stuff as well, where it's intentionally obscure and intentionally difficult, and you try and use as many loan words from whatever your best loan word kind of thing is. And it sounds to me like this is very much a go. Just to say, if the KU Leuven's next research project is editing the Russian Yoke, I would be really happy. So don't dismiss ugly just because we don't like it. It was really popular. It was really, and it's part of the real continuum of what's going on.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't mean to dismiss it. Listen, this is my frustration in trying to understand what they actually mean.
No, sure.
And what is the right text for
Yeah,
there is a kind of edition of the Rashiot in Johann Frenkel's Machzorim for Passover and Shavuot. They are, more than semi-academic, but nevertheless used and for popular use, and one may question how much they're critical, but at least he has a text based on an enormous collection of manuscripts. There is probably place to do more work, especially in terms of linguistics and interpretation. But again, that's for the next year.
That's great. Thank you. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine.